Rome in 46 B.C.E. was a broken system. The Senate was depleted, corruption ran rampant, and the calendar didn't even match the seasons. Enter Caesar, a man with unlimited power, unimaginable wealth, and a willingness to tear up the rulebook. His reforms were radical, but were they enough? And why did Augustus, his heir, succeed where Caesar's vision stalled? This is the story of how crisis created an empire, and the two men who shaped it. The Roman Senate in 46 B.C.E. faced an impossible situation. They needed to acknowledge Caesar's dominance while trying to preserve some shred of republican tradition. Their solution was unprecedented. They offered Caesar a 10-year dictatorship. This wasn't just breaking norms, it was demolishing them. The dictatorship had always been Rome's emergency brake, a 6-month position granted only in times of extreme crisis. Now they stretched it across a decade. It gets more extraordinary when we look at the details. Along with the dictatorship, they granted Caesar 5 consecutive consulships. Under normal circumstances, consuls served 1-year terms with a 10-year gap before re-election. This new arrangement gave Caesar continuous legislative authority without interruption. He became essentially a permanent executive, something Rome had never seen. The Senate's thinking here reveals much about their desperation. Their plan was complex. Give Caesar enough legal power that he wouldn't need to seize more illegally. They hoped that after 10 years of supreme authority, he might voluntarily step aside. It was a gamble that traded constitutional integrity for short-term stability. One important distinction gets lost in modern discussions. This wasn't a military dictatorship in the modern sense. Caesar accepted these roles through existing legal channels. He had himself elected to each position with Senate approval. The system wasn't being openly overthrown, it was being subverted from within. What made this arrangement so dangerous wasn't just its scale, but its precedent. For the first time, Rome saw extended executive power institutionalized rather than exercised through extra-legal means. Future emperors would look back on this moment as the prototype for permanent imperial rule. There's irony in how the Senate moved to preempt Caesar. In trying to contain him legally, they broke Rome's constitutional safeguards forever. Their hope that he'd retire after 10 years proved naive considering everything we know about Caesar's ambitions and self-perception. The powers accumulated here weren't just titles. They came with concrete authorities. The dictatorship gave Caesar supreme military command without oversight. His consulships allowed him to control legislation and preside over Senate meetings. Together, these positions made him untouchable by traditional checks and balances. Historians still debate whether this arrangement represented Senate capitulation or clever maneuvering. Some senators clearly believed they were outplaying Caesar, giving him rope while keeping institutions in reserve. Others must have recognized they were witnessing the Republic's transformation into something else entirely. The 10-year term itself raises questions. Why such a specific duration? It likely reflected practical needs, time to implement sweeping reforms and stabilize post-war Rome. But psychologically, it created expectation of an endpoint that never came. Caesar would be dead before completing half this term. Comparing this to Augustus's later arrangements is instructive. After these precedents, Augustus didn't need such dramatic titles. He could achieve similar control through subtler means, something we'll explore later in our story. One overlooked aspect is how this affected Rome's bureaucratic machinery. Continuous executive control meant officials couldn't rotate through positions as designed. The system assumed periodic leadership changes. Now entire generations of politicians would spend careers answering to one man. The financial implications were equally significant. With Caesar positioned to approve budgets for a decade, fiscal policy became an extension of personal will rather than senatorial consensus. This shift would have cascading effects on taxation and spending throughout the provinces. We should note that none of this was inevitable. Other Civil War victors had restored republican norms before. Sulla emerged victorious from similar conflicts and retired voluntarily. The Senate likely hoped Caesar would follow that precedent. But the differences in circumstances and personalities made Sulla's path impossible for Caesar to follow. Looking ahead, Augustus would study this period carefully. He recognized that institutionalizing power required wrapping it in republican dressing. Caesar's mistake wasn't taking control, but making the transformation too obvious. At the moment, though, in 46 B.C.E., Rome stood at a crossroads. The Senate's offer represented both an attempt to stabilize Rome and the acceleration of its constitutional decay. They chose controlled surrender over continued conflict, a choice that would echo through Roman history. This arrangement also affected Caesar's psychology. Legal sanction for prolonged power likely reinforced his belief that Rome needed strong, centralized leadership permanently. The crisis of governance couldn't be solved temporarily, only permanently restructured. As we turn to Caesar's triumphs, we'll see how he used spectacle to cement this new reality. The Senate had given him the instruments of power. Now he would demonstrate what that power could accomplish. In 46 B.C.E., Julius Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs in quick succession, an extravagant display of military success meant to secure his political dominance. These processions were more than parades. They were statements of power, designed to remind the Roman people and Senate that Caesar was a general unlike any before him. But they also revealed cracks in his public support and highlighted the risks of blending glory with excess. Each triumph told its own story of conquest, but also unearthed hidden tensions simmering beneath the surface of Rome. The first triumph honored Caesar's victories in Gaul. Over the course of nearly a decade, he had subdued a vast swath of territory, defeating numerous tribes that had fiercely resisted Roman domination. The highlight of the procession was Vercingetorix, leader of the Gallic resistance, paraded in chains before the cheering crowds. Vercingetorix, whose name symbolized defiance against Rome, had been left to languish in a Roman prison for 6 years, specifically for this moment. Few things held greater prestige than presenting a captured foreign leader in a triumph, a visible reminder of Caesar's ability to crush even the most formidable enemies. Wagons filled with treasure followed, alongside depictions of Caesar's military victories painted on enormous boards. Yet the Gallic triumph had an inauspicious start. As Caesar's chariot passed the Temple of Fortuna, the wheel suddenly snapped, forcing him to halt and wait for a replacement. Fortuna, the goddess of luck, was not one to be ignored, and many in the crowd viewed this as a sinister omen. Romans were notoriously superstitious, and a broken chariot wheel during a ceremonial entry seemed a clear warning from the gods. While the damage was quickly repaired and the procession continued, whispers of bad fortune lingered over the day's festivities. The Egyptian triumph, coming second, was just as theatrical but carried an entirely different tone. This celebration marked Caesar's intervention in Egypt's internal struggles and his subsequent victory. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, stole the show during this parade. Arsinoe, deposed and subdued, walked behind Caesar's chariot, a reminder of his ability to dictate the affairs of foreign monarchs. She was young, charismatic, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed the crowd. When her execution was expected as part of the proceedings, the Roman people surprised Caesar by demanding her life be spared. Sensing the mood, Caesar made a rare concession and left her in the custody of Rome, where she would reside in a temple rather than meet her end. This move likely angered Cleopatra herself, who saw Arsinoe as a threat to her rule. But for Caesar, the gesture was not without foresight. By sparing Arsinoe, he retained a potential bargaining tool for future conflicts in Egypt, though his personal relationship with Cleopatra may have complicated this dynamic further. If the Egyptian triumph won back some goodwill, the African triumph did just the opposite. This procession commemorated Caesar's defeat of the Numidian king Juba I and his Roman allies in North Africa. Wagons carrying trophies and treasures passed the crowds as usual, but when paintings appeared depicting scenes of Roman deaths, specifically those of the Pompeian general Scipio and the renowned statesman Cato, the cheers began to falter. To the mind of an average Roman citizen, battlefield victories over foreign powers were cause for celebration, but the deaths of fellow Romans, especially prominent ones, were less palatable. Cicero once said of Cato's suicide that it exemplified Roman virtue, and many in the crowd likely shared that sentiment. The decision to highlight these deaths was widely seen as a miscalculation on Caesar's part, and it left an uneasy impression with the populace. Making matters worse, the African triumph paraded not only prisoners of war, but King Juba Thorn's young son, who had been captured during the campaign. The boy, barely more than a child, was presented in chains, a stark image that, instead of showcasing Caesar's mercy, provoked widespread discomfort. The crowd once again called for clemency, this time insisting the boy's life be spared. Caesar, facing mounting pressure, relented and enrolled the young boy in a Roman academy, rather than sending him to his death. While this compromise quieted immediate dissent, it underscored an unsettling tension in the city. Caesar's power was immense, but he was not immune to public opinion. The crowd's ability to sway his decisions suggested that Caesar's popularity, though still vast, was not without limits. The fourth and final triumph was dedicated to Caesar's rapid victory in Asia Minor, originating from his famous battle at Zela. It was here that he reportedly uttered the words, "Veni, vidi, vici," I came, I saw, I conquered, boasting of the speed and decisiveness of the campaign. Yet the Asia Minor triumph felt anticlimactic. Ancient records barely mention its details, and compared to the grand spectacles of Gaul, Egypt, and Africa, this celebration seemed almost like an afterthought. The brevity of this campaign, while commendable for its efficiency, lacked the same level of drama and enduring significance. Still, it served its purpose by adding another laurel to Caesar's growing collection of honors. Over the course of these 4 triumphs, Caesar displayed the tremendous spoils of his conquests. In total, he paraded an estimated 2,000 tons of silver through Rome, an amount equivalent to billions of dollars today. This wealth underscored his unparalleled success as a general, and he did not hoard it. To appease his soldiers, Caesar lavished them with bonuses larger than most men could hope to earn in a lifetime. Ordinary citizens also received distributions of money, part of Caesar's ongoing efforts to maintain his popularity among Rome's lower classes. But for all the wealth and spectacle, the triumphs highlighted just how tenuous Caesar's position truly was. The public's growing unease, especially during the African celebration, revealed a shift in sentiment that Caesar could not ignore. A triumph was supposed to be an affirmation of dominance, a signal of Rome's divine favor upon its victorious general. And yet, these 4 celebrations offered a glimpse of something more complicated. The broken chariot wheel during the Gallic triumph served as a metaphor for unexpected fragility. The public's demand to spare Arsinoe and Juba's son hinted at a growing discomfort with Caesar's perceived cruelty or overreach. Even the veneration of military conquest itself seemed to falter when Romans were reminded of civil war and its cost. In many ways, the triumphs laid bare the contradictions of Caesar's position. He was Rome's savior and destabilizer, a hero bathed in glory but dogged by omens and dissent. While he had lifted the city to unprecedented heights through conquest and reform, the road ahead was fraught with challenges his military victories could not solve. The vast wealth paraded through Rome symbolized opportunity, but it also underscored the inequalities and tensions that Caesar himself had yet to address. Caesar had shown Rome the breadth of his victories and filled its coffers with the fruits of his campaigns. Yet the processions, designed as a symbol of ultimate success, also marked the beginning of new uncertainties. Triumphs could dazzle the eye, but they could not silence whispers of dissatisfaction. From here, Caesar turned his attention to leveraging that wealth. If the triumphs couldn't fully secure his power, perhaps material rewards could. After his triumphs in 46 B.C.E., Caesar faced one of the most pressing problems for any Roman leader: providing for 22,000 retiring soldiers who expected land and bonuses. This wasn't just a matter of keeping promises. Failure could lead to rebellion from men who had weapons and military training. But solving it carelessly could spark even worse consequences, as Roman history showed. The traditional approach required settling veterans without taking land from existing owners. In theory, this meant buying land at fair prices or using public lands. In practice, it often led to violent displacements. Decades earlier, Sulla had dealt with this problem by seizing land from his political enemies through prescriptions. That solved the veteran problem temporarily, but left deep scars in Roman society. The hatred those actions created contributed to later civil wars. Caesar knew repeating Sulla's methods would store up trouble for the future. Caesar's solution was more subtle but still controversial. He passed a law letting struggling farmers sell their land to the state at above-market prices. The government would then distribute these lands to veterans. On paper, this helped both groups. Small farmers got cash to restart elsewhere, while veterans received land without outright confiscations. In reality, the plan had several flaws that became apparent over time. First, the prices paid were artificially high. This wasn't accidental. Caesar needed to make the offer attractive enough for farmers to sell voluntarily, but it meant spending vast sums from the treasury, sums only available because of Caesar's recent conquests. The Gallic Wars had brought in enormous wealth, but even that wouldn't last forever. Second, the plan still displaced people, just more politely than Sulla's methods. A farmer might get good money for his land, but he still had to leave his home and community. Conservative senators objected to several aspects of the plan. Some disliked the expense, seeing it as wasteful spending to buy popularity. Others feared it set a bad precedent. If the state would overpay for land once, veterans might expect similar treatment in future. A few probably resented that Caesar was solving problems they'd failed to address themselves. The political tensions reflected deeper divides about how Rome should function. The scale of the operation was massive. Distributing land to 22,000 veterans required reorganizing entire regions. Caesar focused on Italian territories already familiar with Roman agriculture, avoiding more distant provinces where veterans might struggle. Places like Campania and Etruria saw significant resettlement. The state didn't just hand out land. It provided tools, seed grain, and sometimes even slaves to work the farms. This comprehensive approach helped veterans transition to civilian life. Money played a key role beyond land purchases. Each veteran also received a cash bonus of 5,000 denarii, several years' pay for most soldiers. This came directly from Caesar's war spoils, bypassing the usual treasury controls. The payments created immediate loyalty among the troops, but also reinforced the idea that soldiers should look to their general rather than the state for rewards. This shift in allegiance would have long-term consequences for Roman politics. The financial impact extended beyond immediate costs. By paying inflated prices for land, Caesar created expectations that future settlements would be equally generous. When Augustus later faced the same problem, he had to contend with these raised standards. The system also encouraged corruption, as officials overseeing the program could take bribes to favor certain veterans or landowners. While Caesar's administration was relatively clean, later governments struggled with these issues. Land distribution wasn't the only solution Caesar employed. Some veterans received commercial opportunities instead of farms, particularly in Rome itself. Caesar granted them preferential rights to collect certain taxes or operate businesses in the city. This alternative appealed to soldiers who didn't want to become farmers or who had special skills. It also helped strengthen economic ties between veterans and Caesar's regime. The program's success depended heavily on Caesar's personal wealth and authority. Without the spoils from Gaul, he couldn't have afforded such generous terms. Without his political control, he couldn't have pushed the laws through so quickly. This personalization of state functions worried traditionalists. Normally, such programs would involve extensive Senate debate and oversight. Caesar simply announced his plans and implemented them, treating the Senate as a rubber stamp rather than a governing body. Interestingly, Caesar's approach showed unexpected restraint in some areas. He avoided mass confiscations, even when they might have been easier. He took care to spread settlements across Italy rather than concentrating them in a few areas, and he provided real support to help veterans succeed as farmers rather than just dumping them on empty land. These details suggest he learned from Rome's past mistakes with veteran settlements. The economic effects rippled through Roman society. Land values in settlement areas rose, benefiting nearby landowners. New farming communities stimulated local trade. Some veterans failed at farming and sold their land, creating a secondary market. The influx of cash from bonuses boosted consumer spending in Italian towns. For all its problems, the program did achieve Caesar's immediate goal. It kept his veterans satisfied and loyal. Augustus later refined this approach in important ways. He established military treasury to fund veteran benefits systematically, rather than relying on spoils of war. He created retirement colonies in the provinces, reducing pressure on Italian land. And he standardized the length of service required for benefits, making the system more predictable. These innovations addressed weaknesses in Caesar's ad hoc solution. Caesar's veteran policy also had unintended political effects. By demonstrating that a commander could provide for his troops better than the Senate could, it weakened traditional institutions. Soldiers increasingly saw their general, not the Roman state, as the source of security and rewards. This shift in loyalty made future armies more willing to follow their commanders against the state itself, as would happen repeatedly in Rome's later history. The settlements also changed rural Italy's social fabric. Areas with many veteran colonies became strongholds of support for Caesar and later for Augustus. These communities tended to be more loyal to the central authority than traditional Italian towns were. Over generations, this helped transform Italy from a collection of independent-minded cities into a more unified region loyal to Rome's rulers. Records suggest the program satisfied most veterans, at least initially. Desertions and protests among former soldiers were rare in the following years. But the financial burden on the state continued long after Caesar's death. Future leaders would struggle to meet the expectations he had created without his vast war chests to draw upon. The dilemma of how to reward veterans without bankrupting the state or displacing citizens would persist for centuries. Caesar's solution worked in the short term by preventing military unrest and securing his political position. But like many of his reforms, it created systems that later leaders had to maintain or modify. The veteran settlements show both his practical problem-solving skills and his willingness to bypass traditional constraints when necessary. They also reveal how even well-intentioned solutions could have complex, long-term consequences for Rome's development. In the bigger picture, the veteran crisis highlights how Caesar balanced immediate needs against future stability. While avoiding Sulla's brutality, he still created dependencies that would outlast his rule. Augustus would face similar challenges, but with more time to develop systematic solutions. The contrast between their approaches reflects the larger differences in how each man shaped Rome's transition from republic to empire. The Civil War had left Rome's Senate dangerously depleted by 46 B.C.E. Casualties and retirements created a critical shortage of members, making it difficult to staff provincial governments and maintain basic administration. Caesar faced a straightforward problem. The Republic's governing body no longer had enough people to function properly. His solution would shock Rome's traditional aristocracy beyond anything they'd experienced before. Rather than slowly rebuilding the Senate through traditional means, Caesar took direct action. Using his dictatorial powers, he appointed hundreds of new senators at once. The scale was unprecedented. Rome's elite suddenly found themselves outnumbered by newcomers. Ancient sources suggest the Senate expanded from about 600 members to potentially 900 or more. For the old patrician families who had dominated Roman politics for centuries, this was nothing short of catastrophic. The new senators came from three main groups, each carefully chosen by Caesar for specific reasons. First were retired centurions from his legions, hardened veterans whose loyalty to Caesar was absolute. These men understood military matters better than politics, but their presence guaranteed a voting bloc that would support Caesar without question. Second came wealthy aristocrats from smaller Italian towns that had backed Caesar during the Civil War. Their appointments repaid political debts while bringing in practical administrators. But it was the third group that caused the most outrage: Gallic aristocrats. These were men whose families Caesar had known during his campaigns in Gaul, now granted Roman citizenship and elevated straight to the Senate. To Rome's traditional elite, this was unthinkable. The jokes started almost immediately. One popular quip circulating through Rome's streets went, "The Gauls have crossed the Pomerium. They're asking for directions to the Senate House." The humor masked genuine anxiety about barbarians infiltrating Rome's most sacred institution. The Gallic appointments weren't random. These were aristocrats from tribes that had cooperated with Rome, men who often spoke fluent Latin and had adopted Roman customs. Caesar was fulfilling promises he'd made during the Gallic Wars, in his mind, rewarding allies just as Rome had always done. But tradition said that Senate membership should come only after generations of civic service, not as reward for foreign cooperation. The speed and scale of these appointments made them feel like an invasion to many Romans. Conservatives particularly resented how these new senators gained their positions. Normally, candidates would be scrutinized by censors and elected by existing members. Caesar simply declared them senators by edict. This bypassed centuries of precedent in one stroke. Many lacked the traditional qualifications. No record of magistracies, no famous ancestors, sometimes not even extensive property holdings in Italy. Their main qualification was Caesar's trust. Some of the resistance was practical. These new members diluted the influence of established families. Committee assignments and speaking time now had to be shared with men who'd never participated in Roman politics. More fundamentally, it changed the Senate's character from an exclusive club of Rome's oldest families to a much broader assembly representing different interests. Younger senators from traditional families sometimes found themselves junior to former centurions twice their age. The military appointments especially grated on the aristocracy. Retired centurions were professional soldiers, not politicians. They understood army logistics better than legal debates. Yet now they had equal votes on matters ranging from foreign policy to religious observances. For senators whose ancestors had governed Rome for centuries, sharing power with career soldiers felt like a demotion. The implicit message was clear. Loyalty to Caesar mattered more than noble birth. This wasn't just about hurt pride. The traditional Senate had functioned as a network of aristocratic families balancing each other's power. Caesar's new members disrupted that balance permanently. Many owed everything to him personally rather than to the Republic's institutions. Their votes would reliably back his agenda, regardless of what Rome's old elite thought. The Senate was becoming less an independent governing body and more an instrument of one man's will. Caesar dressed his reform in practical terms. The state needed administrators, and talented men shouldn't be excluded due to birthplace. But contemporaries saw the deeper implications. Cicero privately complained that Caesar was making a new Senate to replace the old one. The appointments weren't temporary emergency measures, but permanent changes to Rome's governing structure. Future senatorial families might now come from Gaul or the ranks of soldiers rather than Rome's traditional elite. The Gallic senators faced particular challenges adjusting. Those who wore their native dress rather than togas became instant targets for ridicule. Their Latin, though fluent, often carried provincial accents that drew snickers in debate. Some tried too hard to act Roman, while others stubbornly maintained distinctly Gallic manners. Either way, they stuck out uncomfortably in Rome's tight-knit political culture. Yet the newcomers weren't passive victims. Many proved capable administrators, especially the Italian aristocrats, who already understood Roman systems. The centurions brought practical knowledge of frontier conditions that often proved valuable in military discussions. Even some Gallic senators gradually earned respect through hard work and competence. Over time, the initial shock gave way to grudging acceptance, though the jokes never fully stopped. Caesar coupled these appointments with other reforms. He increased magistrate positions to give more people government experience. He standardized senatorial dress and behavior to help assimilate the newcomers. He also cracked down on corruption cases, demonstrating that standards would be enforced regardless of background. These measures helped legitimize the changes while strengthening his control over the expanded body. The financial effects are often overlooked. Many new senators needed financial assistance to meet property requirements. Caesar provided it through loans or outright gifts, creating personal obligations. He also controlled access to profitable provincial governorships that could repay these debts. Economic dependency thus reinforced political loyalty among the expanded membership. Augustus later refined this system while maintaining its essence. He kept the Senate's broader composition, but restored more rigorous entry requirements. He allowed traditional families to regain some prestige while maintaining ultimate control. Most importantly, he made the changes feel like natural evolution rather than revolution. Where Caesar had forced transformation rapidly, Augustus allowed it to seem gradual and consensual. The long-term impacts were profound. Within a generation, many new men families became thoroughly Romanized. Their grandchildren would think of themselves as proper Roman aristocrats. The Senate ceased being exclusively the domain of old Roman families and became more representative of the empire's diverse elite. This helped stabilize imperial rule by giving talented provincials a stake in the system. Yet at the time, the expansion felt like an assault on Rome's identity. Traditionalists saw it as confirmation that Caesar cared nothing for republican values. Younger aristocrats worried their careers would be blocked by Caesar's appointees. And everyone recognized that a Senate so dependent on one man's favor could never check his power effectively. The reform thus became another step toward permanent autocracy, however practical its immediate justification. Looking back, we can see how Caesar's Senate reflected his broader approach. He solved practical problems like the membership shortage decisively, but with little regard for tradition. He rewarded loyalty generously, but created systems that depended entirely on his personal authority. And he implemented changes so rapidly that they provoked unnecessary resistance, leaving Augustus to complete the transformation more carefully. The contrast between their methods would become a recurring theme. Caesar broke systems openly and rebuilt them by force of will. Augustus preferred to reshape institutions while preserving their outward forms. Both achieved similar ends, but Caesar's haste created avoidable friction where Augustus would find smoother paths. The Senate's expansion offered an early example of this fundamental difference in their approaches to power. Rome's grain dole system was in crisis when Caesar took power. For years, corruption had plagued the distribution of free and subsidized grain meant for Rome's poorest citizens. The program had grown bloated, with an estimated 320,000 recipients, far more than truly qualified. Middlemen and officials routinely stole or diverted grain, forcing the poor to pay bribes to get what was supposed to be free. Wealthy citizens who didn't need assistance remained on the rolls, while genuinely hungry Romans struggled to get their rations. The system that was supposed to prevent starvation had become its own source of injustice. Caesar's solution was characteristically direct, but politically risky. He slashed the recipient list by more than half, cutting it from 320,000 down to 150,000. This wasn't random cost-cutting. He paired the reductions with strict new verification measures. Officials now conducted house-by-house inspections to confirm poverty status. They used census records to identify citizens who had property or income that disqualified them. The reforms aimed to ensure grain reached only those who genuinely couldn't feed themselves without state help. The political dangers were obvious. Reducing assistance during normal times would be risky. Doing it right after a civil war was extraordinary. The urban poor who depended on the dole were the same crowds who had rioted for years over grain shortages. Cutting benefits could spark unrest that might threaten Caesar's hold on power. Yet financial realities forced his hand. Years of war had drained Rome's reserves, and the dole consumed enormous resources. Maintaining the bloated system wasn't sustainable if he wanted to fund other reforms. Brutus's reaction revealed just how surprising Caesar's move seemed to Rome's elites. Upon hearing about the cuts, Brutus wrote to a friend, joking that Caesar appears to be joining the conservative faction. The comment dripped with irony. Conservatives had long argued for cutting the dole to reduce costs and encourage self-sufficiency. Populists like Caesar had traditionally opposed such measures to maintain plebeian support. Now the roles were reversed. The populist dictator was implementing conservative policies, while the conservatives could only watch in amazement. Cicero's reply to Brutus's quip revealed deeper political currents. When told of Brutus's remark, Cicero responded with his own rhetorical question. Join the conservative faction? Is he planning on killing himself? The barbed comment hinted at multiple layers of meaning. It suggested Caesar might be planning something even more drastic than grain reforms. It also played on the conservatives' reputation for extreme actions. Cicero himself had supported executing Caesar's father-in-law without trial during his consulship years earlier. The exchange showed how Caesar's move had scrambled traditional political alignments. The practical effects of the reforms were immediate and far-reaching. With fewer recipients to feed, the grain supply became more reliable for those who remained eligible. Reduced waste and corruption meant the state could maintain reserves for emergencies. The treasury saved significant funds that could be redirected to other priorities like infrastructure or military pay. But the changes also created hardship for those who lost benefits. Many likely slipped into genuine poverty without the grain they'd come to depend on, even if they hadn't qualified under the rules. Caesar's approach showed his characteristic pragmatism. The reforms weren't driven by ideology, but by practical necessity. He kept the dole in place rather than abolishing it entirely, recognizing its importance for preventing starvation and unrest. But he made it sustainable by removing those who could afford to buy their own grain. The balance satisfied neither conservatives who wanted the dole eliminated, nor radicals who wanted it expanded. It was a pragmatic middle path designed to solve the immediate problem without provoking either extreme. The verification system introduced new bureaucratic controls that would endure for centuries. Each eligible citizen received an official token they had to present to collect their ration. Officials cross-checked these against master lists maintained by neighborhood administrators. The process reduced fraud, but also created Rome's first systematic registration of its poorest citizens, giving the state unprecedented insight into and control over urban populations. Augustus would later expand on these mechanisms to create even tighter oversight. Regional distribution also improved under Caesar's system. Previously, most grain was distributed at a few central locations, forcing recipients to travel long distances and creating chaotic scenes where the strong could take grain meant for the weak. Caesar decentralized distribution to neighborhood stations, making access easier while reducing crowding and disorder. This small logistical change had significant quality of life improvements for Rome's most vulnerable, while also decreasing the spectacle of mass grain lines that had become symbols of urban desperation. The economic ripple effects extended beyond the poor. Reduced grain subsidies meant more supply available on the open market, which benefited merchants and middle-class buyers. Fewer people competing for the free grain allowed prices to stabilize at levels more citizens could afford. The reforms thus helped not just the state treasury, but Rome's overall food economy by making the grain trade function more normally rather than being distorted by the massive dole program. Landlords felt effects too. Many had counted on the dole to supplement their tenants' incomes, allowing them to charge higher rents than tenants could otherwise afford. With fewer people receiving grain, some landlords had to adjust rents downward or risk losing tenants who could no longer pay. This unintended consequence reshaped Rome's housing market in ways that lasted for generations. as property values in poor neighborhoods declined relative to other areas. The reforms also changed Roman politics' long-term dynamics. By proving the dole could be cut without disastrous consequences, Caesar removed a long-standing sacred cow of populist politics. Future leaders would find it easier to adjust the program, knowing Caesar had established the precedent. Augustus used this flexibility to further refine the system while maintaining its core purpose. The changes also weakened the political machines that had grown up around controlling grain distribution, removing a key power base from traditional politicians while centralizing control with Caesar's administration. Personal connections to the reforms reveal much about late Republican politics. Brutus, who joked about Caesar becoming conservative, was the same man who would later help assassinate him. His remark hints at how Caesar's unpredictability frustrated traditional politicians across the spectrum. Cicero's sarcastic response suggests he recognized the deeper implications, that Caesar wasn't adhering to any faction's playbook, but making decisions based on his own assessment of Rome's needs. Both men would struggle against this unpredictable approach in different ways in the coming years. Looking ahead, Augustus would build on Caesar's approach while smoothing its rough edges. He maintained the smaller recipient roles, but added mechanisms to help the near-poor who didn't qualify for free grain. He formalized grain verification into a comprehensive welfare bureaucracy. Most importantly, he depoliticized the issue, making grain distribution seem like an imperial benefaction rather than a political tool. Where Caesar forced change through direct action, Augustus made it feel organic and inevitable. The grain reforms also illustrate how Caesar balanced competing priorities. He needed to stabilize Rome's finances without provoking unrest. He sought efficiency without abandoning the poor entirely. He challenged traditions while maintaining enough continuity to avoid total rupture. This balancing act characterized many of his reforms, moving decisively but without the ideological rigidity that often doomed other reformers. The results were imperfect, but demonstrated a willingness to tackle problems others had avoided. This pragmatism helps explain why later emperors kept many of Caesar's changes in place. The grain system of 46 B.C.E. became the foundation for imperial food policies, precisely because it worked better than what came before, despite initial resistance. Even unpopular decisions could gain acceptance when they solved real problems. A lesson Augustus would take to heart. What began as emergency measures became permanent features of Roman governance because they addressed systemic issues that earlier leaders had merely managed rather than fixed. Rome's calendar in 46 B.C.E. wasn't just broken. It was completely dysfunctional. The existing lunar system had drifted nearly 3 months out of sync with the seasons, creating confusion for farmers, tax collectors, and government officials alike. The problem stemmed from Rome's reliance on the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Pontiffs to manually add extra months when needed. These priestly officials often manipulated the calendar for political reasons, adding days to extend political terms or shortening months when opponents held power. Over decades, such interference led to widespread distrust of official dates, while seasonal festivals drifted into the wrong times of year. Caesar recognized this problem during his Egyptian campaign in 48 B.C.E. Egypt used a solar calendar that stayed aligned with seasons far better than Rome's system. The experience likely planted the idea for reform. After securing power in Rome, Caesar consulted Sosigenes, an Alexandrian astronomer familiar with Egyptian astronomical methods. Together they designed what would become the Julian calendar, a radical departure from traditional Roman timekeeping. The transition required drastic measures. To realign the calendar with the solar year, Caesar added 2 extra intercalary months between November and December, normally forbidden under Roman custom. He also extended the year by 90 additional days, spread through existing months. The result was a 445-day year of confusion, where Romans endured 15 months instead of 12. Farmers had to adjust planting schedules, creditors recalculated interest payments, and officials wrestled with contracts spanning this artificially long year. The new calendar solved several problems at once. It adopted a 365-day solar year divided into 12 months, far more accurate than the irregular lunar months Rome had used. Sosigenes designed the system with automatic leap years every 4 years to account for the solar year's actual length of about 365.25 days. This eliminated priestly manipulation by removing human discretion from the equation. The calendar would now self-correct without political interference. Months received their modern lengths under the new system. January, August, December, and others gained days to reach their familiar 31-day totals, while February kept its 28-day length with leap day additions. The changes created a more balanced distribution than the Egyptian system Sosigenes knew, which used 12 30-day months plus 5 extra days. Romans initially resisted some aspects. The old calendar had started in March with the solar equinox, so shifting New Year's Day to January disrupted traditional religious observances. Practical benefits appeared quickly. Farmers could now rely on consistent planting and harvest dates year after year. Tax collection became more predictable without arbitrary calendar adjustments. Government terms and legal proceedings followed standardized timelines rather than fluctuating month lengths. The system proved so effective that subsequent emperors made only minor adjustments. Augustus tweaked leap year calculations slightly, and later emperors occasionally renamed months in their own honor without altering the underlying structure. Financial systems particularly benefited from the change. Interest calculations had been notoriously complex under the old calendar, with unpredictable month lengths altering payment schedules. The fixed 365-day year with regular months standardized all kinds of financial agreements. Merchants could now plan shipments years in advance without fearing sudden calendar changes that might disrupt shipping schedules or market days. Religious observances required adjustments. Many festivals were tied to lunar phases that no longer matched the calendar months. Caesar allowed most to remain on their traditional dates even when astronomically incorrect. A compromise between reform and continuity that helped ease public acceptance. Over time, some festivals gradually shifted to maintain seasonal relevance, while others remained fixed to their original dates regardless of astronomical accuracy. The calendar's endurance speaks to its effectiveness. When Pope Gregory XIII modified it slightly in 1582 to correct small accumulated errors, he kept Caesar's basic framework intact. Even today's Gregorian calendar differs from Caesar's original, mainly in refined leap year rules, a testament to how well Sosigenes' calculations held up over centuries. Few ancient reforms have remained relevant for so long with so little modification. Implementation wasn't without problems. Many Romans struggled to adjust to the new month lengths and January New Year. Some provinces continued using local calendars alongside the Roman version for decades. Mark Antony reportedly had to issue stern reminders about the new system's adoption when officials ignored it during Caesar's absence. The widespread use of the Julian calendar today shows these transitional difficulties eventually faded. The reform also reflected Caesar's governing style. He identified practical problems regardless of tradition, sought expert advice outside Rome's insular elite, and implemented solutions decisively once convinced of their merit. Where previous leaders had tinkered with partial fixes, Caesar overhauled the entire system while providing enough continuity to ease acceptance. The approach contrasted sharply with Augustus's later tendency to preserve traditional forms while changing their substance. Calendar expertise became valuable political capital afterward. Caesar's heir Octavian, later Augustus, learned astronomy himself to avoid reliance on advisors for subsequent adjustments. Future emperors treated calendar control as an imperial prerogative rather than priestly duty, preventing a return to arbitrary manipulation. The centralized authority over timekeeping became another tool for maintaining imperial stability across Rome's far-flung territories. Economic effects extended beyond simple bookkeeping. Standardized dates facilitated trade across the Mediterranean by synchronizing business schedules from Spain to Syria. Roman officials coordinating provincial administration could reliably schedule communications and travel without worrying about regional calendar discrepancies. The universal system helped integrate diverse cultures into the imperial framework by providing a common organizational structure. Resistance came mostly from traditionalists who objected to any changes in religious observances. Some senators grumbled about losing political leverage from controlling intercalation. But most Romans accepted the reforms quickly once they saw agricultural and commercial benefits outweighing nostalgic attachments to lunar reckoning. Within a generation, complaints faded as the new calendar became part of daily life. Astronomical accuracy improved rapidly under the new system. Roman scientists could now predict celestial events years in advance with unprecedented precision, aiding navigation and astrology alike. The fixed calendar made possible accurate historical records, where earlier chroniclers often couldn't determine exact intervals between events. Modern historians studying Rome still benefit from this reliable dating framework established 2 millennia ago. The Julian calendar achieved what many reforms failed to accomplish, lasting beyond its creator's lifetime while continuing to serve practical needs across changing societies. Its endurance through Rome's fall and medieval Europe's fragmentation demonstrates how effectively Caesar and Sosigenes balanced innovation with functionality. The system became invisible infrastructure, so reliable that most users never consider its revolutionary origins. This unnoticed success contrasts with Caesar's other, more famous reforms that collapsed after his death. Where political and social changes faced reversals during the triumvirate period, the calendar persisted through Rome's subsequent civil wars. Its technical precision insulated it from ideological battles that overturned other Caesarian reforms. Augustus would later recognize this durability when choosing which of Caesar's innovations to preserve or modify. The calendar reform also exemplifies how Caesar used foreign expertise, a tendency that unsettled Roman traditionalists. Sosigenes was an Egyptian scholar, not Roman, yet Caesar trusted his knowledge over Rome's priestly authorities. This pattern recurred in other reforms, where Caesar prioritized practical results above national pride or tradition, a pragmatic approach that yielded lasting achievements despite contemporary criticism. Looking towards Spain, we'll see how Caesar's absence during reforms created opportunities for old enemies to regroup. While Rome adjusted to its new calendar, disaffected survivors of Pompey's faction seized their chance to reignite conflict in distant provinces, a challenge that would test whether administrative brilliance could compensate for military overextension. While Caesar was busy reforming Rome's calendar and grain dole in 46 B.C.E., trouble was brewing in Spain. The Spanish provinces, which had seemed securely under Roman control, suddenly became the center of a dangerous rebellion. The leaders of this revolt weren't strangers. They were Caesar's former allies and the sons of his dead rival Pompey. This wasn't just another provincial uprising. It was a personal betrayal that threatened to undo all the stability Caesar had worked to create. The main instigator was Titus Labienus, once Caesar's most trusted lieutenant during the Gallic Wars. Labienus had defected to Pompey's side during the Civil War, and now he joined forces with Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus Pompey. Together, they rallied the disgruntled legions stationed in Spain. These weren't fresh recruits. They were experienced soldiers who had fought under Pompey and still resented Caesar's rise to power. Their defection wasn't just a military problem, it was a symbolic blow. Labienus knew Caesar's tactics intimately, making him a dangerous opponent. The speed of the rebellion caught Caesar completely off guard. Within weeks, both Spanish provinces, Hispania Citerior and Hispania Ulterior, fell to the rebels. Local officials who had pledged loyalty to Caesar now switched sides without hesitation. Towns that had seemed secure under Roman rule suddenly declared for Pompey's sons. The rapid collapse revealed a harsh truth. Caesar's political settlements in Spain had been fragile from the start. Many local elites had only grudgingly accepted his authority, waiting for an opportunity to rebel. The situation grew worse when the legions themselves defected. These weren't hastily assembled militias. They were professional Roman soldiers, trained and disciplined. Their willingness to join Labienus and the Pompeians showed that loyalty in the Civil War wasn't as settled as Caesar had hoped. Some soldiers may have felt abandoned. Caesar had brought many veterans back to Italy for his triumphs and land settlements, leaving garrisons in Spain understrength and demoralized. Others may have genuinely believed in the Pompeian cause or held personal grudges against Caesar. News of the rebellion reached Rome at the worst possible moment. Caesar was in the middle of implementing his most ambitious reforms: the new calendar, the grain dole adjustments, the Senate expansion. All these projects required his personal attention to succeed. Now he faced an impossible choice: stay in Rome to secure his political reforms, or march to Spain to crush the rebellion. Letting the revolt grow unchecked was too dangerous. Spain was rich in silver and manpower, and a prolonged rebellion could inspire similar uprisings elsewhere. Caesar's response was characteristically decisive. He postponed his domestic agenda and began preparing for another military campaign. This wasn't a minor distraction. It was a full-scale war that would demand months of his time and resources. The Spanish crisis proved that despite his victories at Pharsalus and Thapsus, the civil war wasn't truly over. Pompey's sons and their allies still had the means to challenge him, and Caesar's control over the provinces wasn't as absolute as it seemed. The rebellion also exposed the limits of Caesar's personal authority. He had relied heavily on his reputation and charisma to secure loyalty, but in Spain, that wasn't enough. Local officials and soldiers had sworn oaths to him, yet they abandoned those oaths when given the chance. This wasn't just about military strategy. It was about the difficulty of maintaining control over a vast empire through personal connections alone. Caesar's system worked when he was present to enforce it, but in distant provinces, loyalty could evaporate quickly. Financial factors played a role too. Spain's silver mines were critical to Rome's economy, producing wealth that funded everything from military pay to public works. Losing control of these mines would strain Caesar's already stretched finances. The rebels knew this. By seizing Spain, they weren't just gaining territory, but cutting off a key revenue stream. Caesar couldn't afford to let the situation fester. Every week the rebellion continued, meant more lost silver and more resources diverted from his reforms in Rome. The campaign that followed would become one of Caesar's most difficult. The Spanish terrain favored guerrilla warfare, and Labienus knew how to exploit it. The Pompeian forces avoided large-scale battles, opting instead for hit-and-run tactics that wore down Caesar's troops. Supply lines became a constant problem. Spain's rugged landscape made it hard to move troops and provisions quickly. Caesar, used to the open battles of Gaul, found himself struggling to adapt. Yet the rebellion also revealed weaknesses on the Pompeian side. Gnaeus and Sextus Pompey lacked their father's political skill, and their alliance with Labienus was uneasy at best. The local Spanish tribes, while willing to rebel against Rome, weren't fully committed to the Pompeian cause. Many saw the conflict as a Roman civil war rather than a fight for their own independence. This lack of unified purpose would eventually undermine the rebellion, but in 46 B.C.E., the threat was very real. Augustus would later face similar provincial revolts, but his approach differed sharply from Caesar's. Where Caesar relied on rapid, decisive campaigns, Augustus preferred systematic consolidation, building networks of loyalty through patronage and infrastructure. He learned from Caesar's Spanish crisis that personal authority alone wasn't enough. Stable rule required institutions that could function even when the emperor wasn't personally present. The Spanish betrayal forced Caesar to confront the contradictions in his own governance. He had centralized power in Rome while assuming provincial loyalty would follow naturally. The rebellion proved otherwise. No amount of calendar reforms or Senate appointments could compensate for weak control over the provinces. Caesar's reforms had been designed to stabilize Rome, but Rome was only one part of the empire. In the end, Caesar would march to Spain and defeat the rebels at the Battle of Munda in 45 B.C.E. The victory was hard-won. Caesar himself reportedly had to rally his troops personally when the battle seemed lost. Labienus died in the fighting, and Gnaeus Pompey was captured and executed. But the campaign came at a cost. Valuable time had been lost, and Caesar returned to Rome with new challenges waiting. The Spanish crisis had shown that even at the height of his power, Caesar's control was incomplete. The rebellion also foreshadowed future conflicts. Sextus Pompey escaped and would later become a persistent thorn in Rome's side, using his fleet to raid Italian coastlines. The ease with which provinces could revolt would haunt later emperors, including Augustus. Caesar's Spanish campaign might have ended the immediate threat, but it didn't solve the underlying problem: how to govern an empire that was growing faster than any one leader could manage. Looking ahead, we'll see how Caesar's unfinished reforms and the lingering scars of civil war shaped Augustus's approach. Caesar had centralized power dramatically, but left the system dependent on his personal leadership. Augustus would inherit this unstable legacy and quietly transform it into something more enduring. The Spanish rebellion was just one example of why that transformation was necessary, and how difficult it would be to achieve. When Julius Caesar died in 44 B.C.E., he left behind a transformed but unstable Rome. His reforms had addressed many immediate problems, but most solutions were either temporary or created new complications. The Senate, expanded with loyalists to nearly 1,000 members, had been reshaped as an instrument of Caesar's will rather than properly restructured as a governing body. This made it more pliable in the short term, but also less capable of functioning independently. Hundreds of new senators, including former centurions and Gauls, owed their positions entirely to Caesar's favor, rather than traditional political pathways. The institution lost much of its republican character, while gaining little in organizational efficiency. The veteran settlements demonstrated a similar pattern of partial solutions. Caesar had provided land and bonuses for 22,000 retiring soldiers, addressing an urgent need. But the program's long-term viability remained questionable. The scheme that allowed farmers to sell land to the state at inflated prices worked while Caesar's war chests remained full, but created potential debt problems for future administrations. Many veterans received farmland, but lacked the support systems to succeed as agricultural producers. The settlements were distributed unevenly across Italy, with some regions bearing disproportionate burdens. Augustus would later inherit these unresolved issues and spend years developing more systematic solutions. Calendar reform stood as Caesar's most lasting achievement, yet it remained an isolated success. The new Julian system kept time accurately without political manipulation, solving a problem that had plagued Rome for generations. But this technical triumph wasn't matched by similar overhauls of other institutions. Tax collection, provincial administration, and legal procedures all continued operating with outdated methods even as the calendar modernized. The reform's brilliance highlighted how other systems remained stuck in traditional patterns. The grain dole reduction showed Caesar's willingness to make unpopular but necessary decisions. Cutting the recipient list by more than half removed corruption and waste, making the system sustainable. Yet this action didn't address Rome's underlying economic inequalities or create alternative support for those removed from the rolls. The urban poor who lost benefits had fewer protections, while the landed elite resented any state intervention in food distribution. Like many Caesarian reforms, it fixed an immediate budget crisis without establishing long-term structures. Financial restructuring followed the same piecemeal approach. Caesar conducted a partial debt reform that alleviated some economic pressures, but left fundamental banking practices unchanged. By canceling interest payments accrued during the Civil War and allowing property to repay debts at pre-war values, he prevented economic collapse. However, he didn't create systems to prevent future debt crises, leaving Rome vulnerable to recurring financial instability. The measures worked temporarily but lacked institutional foundations. Provincial administration received attention, but not full reorganization. Caesar extended citizenship to some provincial elites and reformed tax collection in certain regions, yet maintained the overall framework of provincial governance. The system still relied heavily on individual governors' competence, rather than standardized administration. This inconsistency became evident when Spain rebelled, despite Caesar's previous efforts to secure the region. Provincial loyalties remained personal rather than institutional, tied to Caesar's authority rather than systemic governance. Military reforms followed the same pattern of partial modernization. Caesar had learned from his Spanish campaign that provincial garrisons needed better support, but his adjustments were limited. He increased some legions' pay and began recruiting more broadly across Italy, yet didn't establish permanent systems for veterans' benefits or provincial defense. The army still functioned through personal loyalties to generals rather than institutional structures. This oversight would contribute to future civil wars after Caesar's death. Legal changes were equally incomplete. Caesar reduced some court backlogs and modified certain procedures, but didn't codify Roman law comprehensively. The justice system remained cumbersome and vulnerable to political interference. His appointments of judges reflected personal loyalty rather than legal expertise. These partial measures improved functionality temporarily without solving structural problems in Roman jurisprudence. Urban planning in Rome itself saw similar halfway reforms. Caesar initiated several construction projects, including plans for a new Senate house, public libraries, and drainage improvements. But most remained unfinished at his death, leaving Rome's infrastructure only partially modernized. The city still lacked comprehensive urban planning to manage its growing population and complexity. Augustus would later complete many projects Caesar had started, while adding systematic approaches to urban management. The lack of succession planning represented perhaps the greatest oversight. Caesar had centralized so much authority in his own person that the state couldn't function without him. While reportedly considering various heirs, he never formally designated a successor or created mechanisms for stable transition. This left Rome vulnerable to power struggles when he was assassinated. The omission suggests Caesar either didn't anticipate his death or believed his systems could withstand the shock of his sudden removal. Personal governance style underlay all these limitations. Caesar preferred direct action through his own authority rather than building administrative structures that could function independently. He demonstrated genius at solving immediate crises, but less patience for creating lasting institutions. The systems that worked best, like the calendar, were those that could operate automatically without daily oversight. Others depended entirely on his personal attention and faltered in his absence. The contrast with Augustus's later approach would become stark. Where Caesar governed through personal charisma and emergency measures, Augustus would construct durable administrative machinery. Caesar's dictatorship proved what one brilliant individual could accomplish, while Augustus's principate showed what systematic institution building could achieve. Both approaches were necessary for Rome's transition from republic to empire, but they reflected fundamentally different philosophies of governance. Cultural changes also remained unfinished. Caesar had begun shifting Roman identity toward a more inclusive, empire-wide concept of citizenship. His appointments of Gauls to the Senate and extension of Latin rights to certain provinces pointed toward this future. But these measures weren't comprehensive enough to transform Roman society as a whole. Traditionalists still viewed non-Italians as outsiders, and provincial integration remained incomplete. Augustus would continue Caesar's work in this area while implementing more thorough policies. Religious reforms followed the same partial pattern. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar had begun revising certain rituals and priestly appointments, but didn't fully reorganize Roman state religion. The calendar reform was his most significant religious change, detaching timekeeping from political manipulation. Other aspects of religious practice remained traditional, leaving some priests resentful of his limited interventions. This incomplete approach created tensions without fully modernizing religious institutions. Economic policy showed similar limitations. Caesar reformed the coinage by introducing gold aureuses to stabilize currency markets, but didn't create systems to regulate broader economic activity. Debt reforms addressed crises without preventing their recurrence. Grain distribution became more efficient, but didn't stimulate agricultural production. The economy improved under his rule, but remained vulnerable to future disruptions without structural safeguards. The Spanish Rebellion during Caesar's reforms highlighted these systemic weaknesses. The rapid collapse of loyalties in the provinces showed how much his control depended on personal prestige rather than administrative structures. Even military garrisons could change allegiance quickly when Caesar wasn't present to enforce loyalty. This vulnerability would plague his successors until Augustus developed more institutionalized provincial governance. Legislation often took shortcuts around traditional processes. Caesar frequently bypassed senatorial debate through plebiscites or his own dictatorial authority. While efficient, this approach undermined the very institutions he was trying to reform. Laws enacted without proper deliberation often required later revision, as seen with some veteran settlement provisions. temporary measures became permanent solutions by default rather than design. Education and cultural patronage received limited attention. Caesar planned a public library system, but only began its implementation. While supporting certain writers and scholars, he didn't establish systems for public education or intellectual development. Greek knowledge influenced his calendar reforms, but broader cultural exchange remained informal. These missed opportunities left Roman intellectual life less developed than it could have been. The incomplete nature of these reforms shouldn't obscure their significance. Caesar addressed problems that others had ignored for decades, from calendar inaccuracy to veteran settlements. But his solutions were often designed for immediate effect rather than long-term sustainability. The systems he created relied too heavily on his personal oversight and genius. When that oversight suddenly disappeared, much of his work risked unraveling. Augustus's great achievement would be preserving Caesar's vision while making it function systematically. What Caesar accomplished through force of personality, Augustus would institutionalize through careful administration. Together, their approaches transformed Rome permanently, but in very different ways. Augustus observed Caesar's rule carefully and learned critical lessons from its shortcomings. Where Caesar relied on dramatic displays of power, Augustus chose subtlety. Where Caesar governed through personal charisma, Augustus built systems. This fundamental difference in approach determined why Augustus succeeded where Caesar's vision stalled. The veteran settlement problem demonstrated their contrasting methods. Caesar had solved the immediate crisis by allowing land sales at inflated prices, but this created long-term debt issues. Augustus took a more systematic approach. He established military colonies primarily in the provinces rather than Italy, solving two problems at once. Veterans received land without displacing Italian farmers, while Roman culture and oversight expanded into new territories. Augustus also created a military treasury funded by inheritance taxes to provide consistent retirement bonuses. This removed the unpredictability that had plagued Caesar's handouts. Augustus's handling of the Senate showed similar strategic thinking. Where Caesar had overwhelmed the body with hundreds of loyalists, Augustus worked carefully to maintain its dignity while controlling its functions. He reduced membership back to 600 and restored stricter qualification standards. Senators kept prestigious roles like provincial governorships, but Augustus ensured these appointments went to trustworthy men. The Senate retained legislative procedures and debate, yet real power rested with Augustus through his control of the army and provincial administration. This balancing act preserved traditional forms while concentrating actual authority. Propaganda became another area where Augustus demonstrated greater sophistication. Caesar had relied on spectacular triumphs and public generosity. Augustus cultivated a quieter but more pervasive image through statues, coins, and architectural projects. The Res Gestae, his official account of achievements, framed his rule as service to Rome rather than personal glory. Poets like Virgil and Horace reinforced themes of peace and renewal under Augustus's guidance. Where Caesar's propaganda shouted, Augustus's whispered, and proved more enduring. Institution building represented Augustus's most significant improvement over Caesar. Recognizing that personal rule was unstable, he created durable administrative structures. The Praetorian Guard provided security, the cursus honoris defined political careers, and provincial governance became more standardized. Tax collection and infrastructure maintenance followed set procedures rather than ad hoc arrangements. These systems could function with minimal direct oversight, making the empire governable by successors less capable than Augustus himself. Military reforms followed the same institutional approach. Caesar's legions had been loyal first to their commanders. Augustus created a standing professional army with standardized pay, terms of service, and retirement benefits. The military became loyal to the idea of Rome rather than individual generals, reducing the risk of civil wars. Border defenses received systematic attention, with permanent fortifications and garrison assignments. These changes created stability that lasted centuries, compared to the chaos following Caesar's death. Economic policies showed similar foresight. Augustus stabilized Rome's currency with consistent gold, silver, and bronze denominations. He promoted trade through road and harbor improvements, while regulating markets to prevent shortages. Provincial tax systems became more predictable with census-based assessments. Where Caesar had spent lavishly from war spoils, Augustus focused on sustainable growth through infrastructure and commerce. The resulting prosperity lasted generations, rather than vanishing with the conqueror's treasury. Leadership transition illustrated another key difference. Caesar had no clear succession plan, contributing to immediate power struggles after his assassination. Augustus spent decades grooming potential heirs through strategic adoptions and shared governance experience. While not always successful, his first choices died prematurely. The effort itself demonstrated recognition that systems outlast individuals. The principle of dynastic succession became embedded in imperial governance thanks to Augustus's planning. Religious reforms followed the pattern of balancing tradition with innovation. Augustus restored ancient temples and revived neglected ceremonies, while subtly adapting them to support imperial authority. The cult of the emperor's genius became widespread, without replacing traditional Roman gods. Religious festivals emphasized harmony between imperial leadership and divine favor, reinforcing Augustus's legitimacy through spiritual channels Caesar had neglected. Cultural policies extended this blend of conservatism and control. Augustus sponsored building projects that transformed Rome's appearance while promoting his agenda. The Forum of Augustus and Ara Pacis altar mixed artistic excellence with political messaging. Literary patronage produced works that glorified Rome's destiny under imperial guidance. Where Caesar had focused narrowly on practical reforms, Augustus cultivated an entire cultural ecosystem supporting his vision. Provincial administration benefited from Augustus's systematic approach. Governors received clearer instructions and faced stricter oversight than under Caesar's ad hoc arrangements. Census operations provided accurate population data for taxation and conscription. Municipal charters standardized local governance while maintaining regional customs where harmless to Roman interests. The empire became more unified administratively without imposing complete cultural uniformity. Augustus's methods reflected deeper understanding of Roman psychology. Caesar had forced change through visible displays of dominance. Augustus preferred gradual transformations wrapped in traditional language. When expanding imperial power, he used existing offices like the tribuneship, rather than creating obviously autocratic positions. Romans accepted increasing centralization because it didn't feel like abrupt revolution. Some contrasts remain debatable. Augustus benefited from timing. He ruled decades compared to Caesar's brief dictatorship. Rome after Actium was more ready for stability than during Caesar's civil wars. Yet the consistency of Augustus's institutional approach suggests these weren't mere historical accidents. His systems proved flexible enough to survive the sometimes incompetent emperors who followed, which Caesar's personal rule likely couldn't have endured. Financial management provides a revealing comparison. Caesar solved problems through massive spending of war spoils. Augustus established sustainable revenue streams through taxation and trade. The difference between these approaches became obvious when Augustus's treasury continued functioning smoothly after his death, while Caesar's system had relied entirely on his continued conquests. The long view favors Augustus's model. Where Caesar's most lasting reform was the technical achievement of calendar revision, Augustus reshaped Roman governance fundamentally. The imperial bureaucracy, provincial administration, military organization, and even cultural identity all bore his imprint for centuries. While both men were essential in Rome's transition from republic to empire, Augustus built frameworks that made imperial government work beyond any individual ruler's lifespan. The final test came after their deaths. Caesar's assassination sparked renewed civil wars within months. Augustus's passing produced orderly succession despite occurring during a military crisis on the German frontier. This contrast highlights their differing legacies. One man who remade Rome through sheer personal force, another who constructed systems resilient enough to survive his absence. Military loyalty patterns demonstrate this clearly. Caesar's legions fought for Pompey, then Caesar, then Brutus, then Antony in rapid succession based on personal allegiance. Augustus's professional army maintained consistent loyalty to the imperial office rather than individual claimants, preventing the repeated civil wars of the late Republic. Urban development offers another telling comparison. Caesar left building projects unfinished at his death. Augustus not only completed many of these, but established maintenance systems for roads, aqueducts, and public spaces. This institutionalized care for infrastructure lasted generations, rather than depending on each emperor's personal interest. The ultimate verdict lies in continuity. Caesar's Rome fractured immediately without him. Augustus's systems endured through competent and incompetent emperors alike for nearly 3 centuries in the West and far longer in the East. While Caesar's genius made the empire possible, Augustus's statecraft made it last. Their linguistic legacies capture the difference succinctly. We remember Caesarian as something done by drastic intervention. Augustan suggests a period of stability and refinement. One term describes forceful action, the other sustained achievement. Rome required both types of leadership in its transformation, but Augustus's approach proved more foundational for imperial government. Provincial rebellions declined markedly under Augustus's system. Where Caesar faced uprisings in Spain and elsewhere, Augustus secured lasting peace through better governance and fairer treatment of subject peoples. The absence of major revolts during his long reign speaks to the effectiveness of his administrative reforms compared to Caesar's military solutions. Lawmaking processes show similar evolution. Caesar legislated primarily through personal authority as dictator. Augustus worked through Senate consultation and traditional assemblies, maintaining republican forms while ensuring his preferred outcomes. This approach made reforms more palatable and durable than Caesar's top-down decrees. Citizenship expansion followed comparable patterns. Caesar granted citizenship selectively for political advantage. Augustus established systematic criteria, extending it gradually to provincial elites who adopted Roman culture. This created a stable framework for imperial expansion rather than ad hoc grants tied to immediate circumstances. The military treasury exemplifies Augustus's institutional thinking. By dedicating specific tax revenues to veteran benefits, he created perpetual funding independent of the emperor's whims. Caesar had relied on unpredictable war spoils for similar purposes, making long-term planning impossible. Border policy demonstrates the same contrast. Caesar campaigned where opportunity or ambition dictated. Augustus established permanent frontier defenses with strategic depth, stationing legions at key points for generations, rather than moving them constantly. This provided stability Caesar's reactive approach couldn't match. Perhaps the greatest testament to Augustus's success lies in how quickly his systems became taken for granted. Within a generation, Romans couldn't imagine alternative governance structures. Caesar's Rome remained clearly transitional. Everyone recognized his rule as extraordinary. Augustus made imperial government seem inevitable, even natural. Both approaches were necessary. Caesar's daring broke the republican deadlock. Augustus's patience built lasting alternatives. But where Caesar's legacy depended on personal brilliance, Augustus created systems that ordinary men could operate. In the end, Rome became an empire not through one man's vision alone, but through institutions that could outlive their creator. Rome's transformation from republic to empire required both Caesar's boldness and Augustus's patience. Caesar shattered the old system to implement sweeping reforms, but his solutions relied too much on personal authority. Augustus took those broken pieces and constructed stable institutions that could function without him. There's irony in their legacies. We remember Caesar's brilliance more vividly, yet Augustus's systems endured centuries longer. The calendar remains Caesar's most lasting single achievement, but Augustus reshaped nearly every aspect of Roman governance. Both approaches were necessary, but history ultimately favored the quiet builder over the charismatic revolutionary. Their partnership, one beginning what the other completed, demonstrates how lasting change often requires different types of leaders at different moments. The empire contained elements of both visions, but Augustus's version proved more capable of surviving its creator.